The billionaire mocked her cooking, then realized it was his childhood favorite. "I told you, no more stews," he hissed. The billionaire stared at the humble bowl of stew with pure disgust. To a man who owned half the city's skyline, this looked like nothing more than peasant food. He picked up the spoon, his lips curled in a cynical sneer, ready to deliver a critique that would ruin the young girl's career forever. But the moment the first drop touched his tongue, the cold glass walls of his penthouse began to shatter. The bitterness in his heart was suddenly replaced by a flavor he hadn't tasted in 30 years. Suddenly, he wasn't a powerful CEO anymore. He was a shivering 7-year-old boy back in a tiny, sun-drenched cottage. He saw his grandmother's calloused hands, felt the only love he'd ever known, and realized this girl had found the one secret his billions could never buy. A single hot tear splashed into the broth as the most powerful man in the city began to tremble. He looked up at the poor girl he had spent weeks mocking and asked the one question that would change both of their lives. How? No one knows this recipe. Liam Thorne was a man who had everything, but felt nothing. From the top floor of his skyscraper, the world looked like a series of numbers and strategic acquisitions, devoid of any real warmth or color. His world was built of glass, steel, and a coldness that kept people at a distance. In the boardroom, he was a predator. In his personal life, he was a ghost haunting a palace of high-end finishes and silent hallways. As a billionaire CEO, he demanded perfection, especially in his kitchen. Every meal was expected to be a masterpiece of precision, served at the exact temperature and plated with surgical accuracy. He didn't eat for pleasure. He ate for efficiency, viewing food as nothing more than biological fuel. His previous chefs were world-renowned, trained in Paris and Tokyo, yet none of them could satisfy the phantom hunger that gnawed at his soul. When a clerical error brought Maya, a young woman with a bright smile and flower on her apron, into his penthouse as his temporary private chef, Liam was ready to dismiss her before she even set down her knives. She looked entirely out of place amidst the polished chrome and Italian marble. While his usual staff wore stiff white linens, Maya wore a simple, practical outfit that suggested she actually touched the food she prepared. "I asked for a Michelin-starred artist," Liam said, his voice dripping with condescension as he watched Maya unpack simple, organic vegetables. He stood by the counter, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the humble ingredients she was pulling from her bag. Carrots with the greens still attached, earthy potatoes and fragrant bundles of thyme. Not someone who looks like they're preparing a school lunch. He didn't even look her in the eye, focusing instead on a small blemish on a tomato, as if it were a personal insult to his lifestyle. Maya didn't flinch. She had seen men like Liam before, men who used their wealth as armor, hiding their insecurities behind a wall of gold and arrogance. She continued to set up her station with a calm, rhythmic grace that irritated him even more. "Food isn't about stars, Mr. Thorne," she replied softly. She finally looked at him, her gaze steady and unafraid. "It's about how it makes you feel," Liam scoffed, leaning against the marble counter. He checked his watch, already bored with the conversation. "It makes me feel fueled. That is its only purpose. Do not waste my time with home-style sentimentality." Throughout the week, the tension was thick. Every morning, Maya arrived with fresh ingredients, and every evening, Liam met her with a fresh wave of criticism. He seemed determined to break her spirit, to prove that her soulful approach to cooking was a farce in the face of his superior standards. Liam mocked her techniques, laughing at her refusal to use expensive molecular gastronomy kits. He would stand over her shoulder as she hand-chopped onions, pointing out that a high-speed processor could do it in seconds. He watched her deglaze a pan with wine and sneered, asking why she wasn't using a centrifuge to extract the flavors like the chefs at his favorite clubs. He called her cooking pedestrian and peasant food, barely glancing at the vibrant salads and perfectly seared proteins she placed before him. Maya would present him with a roasted chicken that smelled of rosemary and lemon, only for Liam to push it away after one bite, claiming it lacked complexity. He wanted foams, gels, and edible gold. She gave him nourishment and heart. Despite his constant verbal attacks, Maya remained patient, her heart aching for the lonely man behind the bank account. She saw through the billionaire facade. She noticed that while he spoke of perfection, he looked exhausted. He moved through his life like a man holding his breath, waiting for something that never arrived. She noticed the way he stared at an old, faded photograph on his desk, a photo of a woman in a rustic kitchen, her face blurred by time. Whenever Liam thought he was alone, his eyes would drift to that small silver frame. His expression would soften for a fleeting second before he caught himself and snapped the mask of the cold CEO back into place. Maya realized that this photograph was the only thing in the entire penthouse that wasn't for sale. On her final night, Maya decided to take a risk. The assignment was almost over, and she knew that if she followed the menu Liam had dictated, she would leave him exactly as she found him, cold, empty, and alone. She didn't consult the list of complex dishes he had requested. Instead, she spent hours simmering a slow-cooked beef stew with root vegetables, seasoned with a specific blend of herbs she had grown herself. She ignored the high-tech gadgets in the kitchen, opting for a heavy cast-iron pot. The aroma began to fill the penthouse, not the sterile chemical scent of high-end cuisine, but something deep, savory, and ancient. It was the scent of a kitchen where people actually lived. When she placed the bowl in front of him, Liam's eyes darkened. He looked at the thick, brown gravy and the chunks of tender beef as if she had served him a bowl of mud. The simplicity of the dish seemed to offend his very sense of status. "I told you, no more stews. This looks like something from a roadside diner." He threw his linen napkin onto the table, preparing to stand up and walk away. "Just one bite," Maya whispered, her eyes pleading. She stood her ground, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. "If you hate it, I'll leave and never charge you a cent." Liam let out a sharp, cynical laugh. He looked at the bowl, then at Maya, then back at the bowl. He picked up the spoon, ready to deliver a crushing critique that would finally send her packing. He wanted to prove her wrong once and for all. But as the first taste hit his tongue, the world around him fractured. The cold, sterile penthouse vanished. The expensive furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the weight of his billions evaporated into a mist of memory. He wasn't the billionaire Liam Thorne anymore. He was 7-year-old Liam, sitting at a wooden table in a tiny cottage. He felt the warmth of the sun through a cracked window and saw his grandmother's calloused hands placing this exact dish in front of him. The flavor was an exact match. The specific sweetness of the carrots, the earthy richness of the thyme, and the way the beef melted away. It was the taste of the only time in his life he had ever felt truly loved. Before the tragedy, before the foster systems, and before the relentless pursuit of money had numbed his soul. The spoon trembled in Liam's hand as the silence of the penthouse became deafening. The flavor of the stew acted like a key to a room he had locked away decades ago, a room filled with the scent of pine needles and the sound of a crackling hearth. He wasn't seeing the grey skyline of the city anymore. He was seeing the worn, wooden grain of his grandmother's kitchen table. In that small cottage, he hadn't been a Thorne. He had just been Liam, a boy who was allowed to be small, allowed to be hungry, and allowed to be safe. He remembered how his grandmother would hum while she stirred the pot, the steam fogging up her glasses. She would tell him that the secret ingredient wasn't found in a spice jar, but in the time you were willing to wait for the flavors to marry. It was the only place where the world felt kind. But then the accident happened. The cottage was sold, and Liam was tossed into a foster system that valued efficiency over empathy. He had spent the next 30 years building a fortress of wealth so that no one could ever take anything from him again, only to realize he had lost the very thing worth keeping. A single hot tear escaped his eye and splashed into the broth. He didn't wipe it away. He couldn't. The wall he had built around his heart didn't just crack. It shattered under the weight of a simple, honest meal. He looked up at Maya, his face stripped of its mask. The arrogance, the coldness, and the mockery were gone, replaced by a raw, staggering vulnerability that made him look like that 7-year-old boy again. "How?" he choked out, his voice breaking in a way his employees would never have recognized. He looked at the bowl as if it were a miracle, or perhaps a haunting. No one knows this recipe. She died before she could write it down. He had hired world-class chefs to recreate this very taste, giving them descriptions of the herbs, the texture, but they always returned with something too refined, too balanced, or too Michelin. They couldn't recreate the imperfections that made it perfect. Maya didn't move toward him, giving him the space to breathe through the memory. She stood by the counter, her expression soft and knowing. She didn't have to write it down, Maya said, her hand resting gently on the table near his, offering a comfort he hadn't known he was allowed to take. Love has a flavor, Liam. I just cooked what I thought you were missing. She explained that she hadn't found a secret book or a hidden file. She had simply looked at the photograph on his desk, the one of the woman in the rustic kitchen. She saw the way the herbs were drying in the background of the photo, recognized the specific type of heirloom carrots in the basket, and understood the soul of the woman who was cooking. Maya had cooked with the same intention, not to impress, but to heal. She had realized that Liam Thorne wasn't hungry for food. He was starving for a connection to the only person who had ever truly seen him. In that moment, the billionaire realized that while he had bought the whole world, he had forgotten the taste of home. The vastness of his empire suddenly felt like a heavy shroud. He looked around at his high-tech kitchen and his designer furniture, and for the first time they looked like what they were, expensive distractions. He had been running so fast and for so long that he had outrun his own soul. The mocking stopped entirely. He didn't care about the Michelin stars anymore, nor did he care about the clerical error that had brought Maya to his door. He realized he didn't want a chef who followed his orders. He wanted the warmth Maya carried in her spirit, a warmth that could turn a sterile penthouse into a home. For the first time in 20 years, Liam Thorne finally felt full, not because his stomach was satisfied, but because the hollow space in his chest had finally been occupied by something real. He took another bite, slower this time, savoring the salt and the earthiness. He looked at Maya, and for the first time since she had arrived, he offered her a real smile, not a smirk of triumph, but a quiet expression of gratitude. The journey of the billionaire and the girl with the flower on her apron was just beginning, but the war between them was over. The morning after the dinner that changed everything, Liam walked into the Thorne Industries headquarters with an aura that felt different. The usual sharp, jagged edge of his presence had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative stillness. His executives, accustomed to a man who barked orders before the elevator doors even opened, stood in confused silence. Liam didn't look at his watch once. Instead, he stopped by the receptionist's desk and noticed, for the first time in 3 years, that she had a bouquet of daisies sitting in a vase. "They're lovely, Sarah," he said, his voice level and genuine. The receptionist nearly dropped her phone in shock. Liam Thorne didn't know names, and he certainly didn't notice flowers, but the memory of Maya's kitchen, the earthy scent of the herbs, and the honesty in her eyes was still clinging to him like a soft light. He felt as though he had been colorblind his entire life, and had suddenly been gifted the ability to see the spectrum. However, in the world of high finance, change is often viewed as a weakness. His COO, Marcus Vane, watched Liam through the glass walls of the conference room. Marcus was a man who thrived on Liam's ruthlessness. It was the engine that drove their stock price higher. Seeing Liam smile at an employee sent a ripple of unease through Marcus's calculating mind. To the sharks in the boardroom, a billionaire with a heart was a billionaire with a target on his back. While Liam was grappling with his corporate identity, Maya was back in her own world, a cramped but sun-drenched apartment in a neighborhood that the elite usually ignored. She wasn't just a wandering chef, she was the sole provider for her younger brother Leo, who suffered from a chronic respiratory condition. The clerical error that had placed her in Liam's penthouse hadn't been an error at all. She had spent her last few dollars to bribe a temp agency worker to put her name at the top of the list for high-paying private gigs. She felt a pang of guilt as she scrubbed her modest wooden table. She had gone into Liam's home out of desperation, but she had stayed because she saw a man who was just as broken as the world she lived in. She thought about the single tear that had fallen into his stew. It was a heavy secret to carry. She knew that if Liam ever found out she had manipulated her way into his life, the fragile bridge of trust they had built would collapse. Maya looked at the small herb garden on her windowsill, the source of the herbs that had unlocked Liam's past. To her, these plants were a connection to her own mother's teachings. To Liam, they were a miracle. As she prepared a simple meal for Leo, she wondered if she was falling for the man or the mission of saving him. The billionaire mocked the poor girl's cooking, but in doing so, he had invited her to see the one part of him that was still human. By Thursday, the corporate whispers had turned into a roar. Rumors were swirling that Liam Thorne had lost his edge or was suffering from a midlife crisis. To silence the critics and prove he was still the king of the jungle, Marcus Vanney pressured Liam into hosting an impromptu gala for their top investors at the penthouse. It was a strategic move designed to force Liam back into his role as the cold, perfectionist host. And Liam, Marcus added, his eyes narrowing, hire a real catering team. None of this rustic nonsense. We need gold leaf and caviar. We need to remind them who you are. Liam felt a surge of the old irritation. But then he thought of Maya. He thought of the way she didn't flinch when he yelled. He thought of how she told him that food is about how it makes you feel. Instead of calling a French catering firm, Liam picked up the phone and called Maya. He didn't order her to come. He asked. He told her about the gala, about the pressure from the board, and about his desire to show these people that there was more to life than fueling their egos. He asked her to cook the main course, not for him, but for the world that had forgotten what honesty tasted like. Maya hesitated, knowing the risks of being exposed, but the hope in Liam's voice was something she couldn't refuse. The penthouse was transformed into a glittering arena of power and pretension. Men in $5,000 suits and women draped in diamonds paced the marble floors, their laughter sounding like the clinking of expensive crystal. Marcus Vane moved through the crowd like a shark in a silk suit, whispering to investors that the old Liam was back, and that the evening's display would prove his unwavering commitment to excellence. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was entirely different. Maya worked with a focused, quiet intensity, surrounded by the high-tech appliances that once felt so alien to her. She had ignored the caviar and the truffles Marcus had sent over, choosing instead to prepare a sophisticated variation of the rustic dishes that had first touched Liam's heart. She knew that tonight wasn't just about food. It was about Liam standing in his own kingdom. Liam stood by the balcony, watching the city lights. He felt like an outsider in his own home. Every time an investor approached him to talk about profit margins or hostile takeovers, he found his eyes drifting toward the kitchen. He wasn't looking for a perfect plate. He was looking for the woman who had reminded him he was human. He realized that while he had spent years building walls of glass and steel, Maya had managed to walk right through them with nothing but a wooden spoon and a bit of kindness. As the main course was served, a hush fell over the dining room. Instead of the expected microscopic portions of avant-garde foam, the guests found themselves staring at beautifully plated, heartwarming dishes that radiated a comforting heat. Marcus's face turned a deep shade of crimson as he looked at his plate. "What is this?" he hissed under his breath, leaning toward Liam. "I told you to hire professionals, not a soup kitchen volunteer." Liam didn't answer. He took a bite of the herb-crusted root vegetables Maya had prepared, a refined nod to the garden in his grandmother's old photograph. Around the table, the reactions were unexpected. One of the oldest, most cynical investors, a man known for his cold-blooded negotiations, suddenly put down his fork and stared off into the distance. His eyes grew misty, the same way Liam's had nights before. The peasant food that Liam had once mocked was doing something the most expensive catering in the world couldn't. It was stripping away the masks. The conversation shifted from quarterly earnings to childhood memories. For a brief moment, the room wasn't filled with billionaires and rivals. It was filled with people who were finally remembering what it felt like to be home. Liam looked at Maya, who was watching from the kitchen doorway, and he felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with his stock price. The peace of the evening was abruptly shattered when Marcus, desperate to regain control of the narrative, stood up and addressed the room. "I think we should all thank our temporary help," he said, his voice dripping with the same condescension Liam had once used. "It's truly a testament to Liam's charity that he allowed a girl from the streets to practice her hobby in a kitchen like this." He looked directly at Maya, his smile cruel. He didn't stop there. Marcus pulled a folder from his jacket, the result of a background check he had run the moment he felt his influence slipping. "Of course," Marcus continued, "we should also admire her creativity in getting the job. It's amazing what a small bribe at a temp agency can buy, isn't it, Maya?" The room went silent. Liam's heart sank as he looked from Marcus's triumphant face to Maya's pale, frozen expression. Maya didn't deny it. She couldn't. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, the weight of her secret finally crushing her. She looked at Liam, searching for the man who had cried into his stew, but for a second the billionaire CEO mask seemed to slide back into place. The mockery he had once directed at her seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. He had been tricked, and in his world, being tricked was the ultimate sin. The silence in the penthouse was sharper than any of Liam's previous insults. Marcus stood there, a predator enjoying the kill, while the wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Liam felt a familiar, cold weight settling in his chest, the same steel and glass wall he had built to protect himself from the world. He looked at Maya, his eyes searching for a lie, but all he found was a raw, staggering vulnerability. "Is it true?" Liam's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just because of the agency bribe, but because he had allowed himself to be seen by someone who had entered his life under false pretenses. The billionaire who demanded perfection felt like a fool, and in his world, a fool was a vulnerable target. Maya didn't flinch, even as tears began to brim in her eyes. She had used her wealth of spirit as armor, but now that armor was gone. "I did what I had to do to survive, Liam," she said, her voice trembling. "But the food, the way it made you feel, that was never a lie." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the service elevator, leaving the smell of rosemary and the ghost of a happy memory behind. With Maya gone, Marcus attempted to steer the evening back to business. "Now that the distraction is handled," he announced, gesturing toward the wine, "let's discuss the merger." But the energy in the room had shifted. The investors, who had just been reminiscing about their own childhood homes and the taste of love, looked at Marcus with a newfound distaste. The cold, calculating world he represented suddenly felt hollow. Liam sat at the head of the table, staring at the empty seat where Maya's presence usually brought a sense of warmth. He picked up his fork and took another bite of the meal she had prepared. It was still the taste of the only time in his life he had ever felt truly loved. He realized that while Marcus had exposed a clerical error, Maya had exposed a truth that was much more valuable. Liam was starving for a connection his money could never buy. "The gala is over," Liam said, standing up abruptly. His voice was no longer condescending. It was final. He ignored Marcus's protests and the confused looks of the investors. He walked to his desk and looked at the faded photograph of his grandmother in her rustic kitchen. He finally understood that Maya hadn't just been a chef. She had been a mirror reflecting the man he used to be, before the relentless pursuit of money had numbed his soul. Liam spent the next 48 hours in a penthouse that felt more like a tomb than ever before. Every corner reminded him of Maya, the scent of fresh herbs, the way she had mocked his expensive kits, and the way she had seen the lonely man behind the bank account. He tried to eat the food his new high-priced catering team provided, but it tasted like ash. It had no heart, no story, and no love. He realized that he didn't want a Michelin-starred artist or someone to provide biological fuel. He wanted the warmth Maya carried in her spirit. He began to investigate the error Marcus had used against her, discovering the truth about her brother Leo and the desperation that had driven her to his door. She hadn't been a con artist. She had been a sister fighting for her family with the only weapon she had, her grandmother's recipes. Liam Thorne, the billionaire who once laughed at simple meals, found himself driving into a neighborhood he had never visited. He wasn't looking for a business deal or a new acquisition. He was looking for a small apartment with a herb garden on the windowsill. He was looking for the girl who had reminded him that while he had bought the whole world, he had forgotten the taste of home. He was ready to stop being a ghost in a glass kingdom and finally start living. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, what is the one childhood dish that always brings you back home? We read every single story you share.